Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Kenna Hernley. I am the Senior Officer for Place-Based Peer Learning here at Arts Council England. I am white female. I have brown hair, blue eyes, lots of freckles, and I'm wearing a black turtleneck and a black and white patterned jumper. I am pleased to be here today. I'm supported by our BSL interpreter, Josie, who is currently on screen, and Danny, who will be alternating with Josie. My colleague Lucy is also here today. She will be moderating the chat and helping out with Zoom. I would like to introduce our speaker for today, who is Jack Roscoe. He is coming to us from the Digital Culture Network, where he is a tech champion in data methodologies and systems. This is the third event in our new series of how-to events at the Place-Based Peer Learning Program. And here these are intended to be practical sessions to help you build skills, develop your practice, and solve issues. This session is how to collect data in a public space, and it is the third in our series on data and evaluation. This series is part of the Place-Based Peer Learning Program, and we co-created this program with representatives from Creative People and Places, local cultural education partnerships, and cultural compacts. This how-to series was developed in response to a request for expert guidance in skill building and problem solving. We offer other types of events that create space for networking and workshops that dive deeper into topics. If you would like to connect with anyone in this session afterwards, you can do so through our networking platform, Hivebright, where you can find a list of attendees in the event information. I would like to welcome our speaker for today and hand it over to Jack.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here today. So today's webinar will possibly be up to 1 hour, including Q&A and a sort of open discussion at the end. So I think Ken has covered most of the stuff on my slide here. Do say hello in the chat. Let us know, who you are, what organization you're from, where you are in the country. And you're welcome to, I think you can use the reaction buttons as well, although there aren't many jokes today, so that's fine. So can I make it change slide? Yes, I can. So today's webinar is how to collect data in a public space. So my name is Jack Roscoe, and for those who would benefit from a visual description, I'm a white man in my early 30s. I've got brown hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a sort of orange jumper. So I'm the audience data collection and evaluation tech champion at the Digital Culture Network. Just to expand a little bit on who we are, we're a free support service available to everyone in the creative and cultural sector in England. It's part of Arts Council England, and our job is to help grow and support the digital skills in our sector. So we have 12 different tech champions like me who cover a range of different topics to do with digital, marketing, websites, audiences, ticketing and box office, social media and video content, and data insights. So all of the things that people often struggle with, we're here to help. We mainly do that with one-on-one support, which is completely free and unlimited. So towards the end, I'll share some details on how you can get in touch with us, if that sounds good. There is a page on our website with, well, it doesn't have them yet, but after the presentation, I'll make sure they're up. All of the slides from today and a few links to some of the things I'm talking about today as well. So you can scan that QR code, you can follow that link, and I think that will be available on the Place-Based Peer Learning Network as well, in case you want to follow up on anything that I've said today. So today, we'll be covering these topics. I'm going to define what a public space is, exciting. We'll be looking at evaluation examples that might be useful, and then we'll talk about the challenges and practical methods for collecting data in public spaces, some of my experience and some things that we might want to try out. And we also want to have an open discussion as well in today's session, which I'll talk more about in a moment. So this webinar is mainly concerned with audience data collection in public spaces, And by audience data collection, we could mean a few things, ranging from surveys and having conversations, counting people, observing them, or doing more creative methods to collect data. And I'll come on to that towards the end. And by public spaces, that might cover a variety of different settings where we as organizations put on work. So that might be high streets and shopping centers. It could be community spaces, indoors and outdoors, festivals and events. And in terms of the types of works and interventions we might be thinking of, it could be things like public performances, art, dance or music, installations or experiences, activities, crafts workshops, all of the above. Hopefully everyone's represented here. But if I've missed anything that you do, maybe we can talk about that towards the end, or you can let us know in the chat. So I've got to admit, I've worked collecting data in a variety of different places and situations in this sector, and I've got a good idea of the challenges and the options that are generally available. But I've mainly worked as a commercial supplier. We often use longer surveys, we use professional interviewers, and we always got there in the end, but longer surveys didn't always feel appropriate for some audiences and some events. So I've got a couple of examples in today's webinar of larger projects and the types of evaluation and data collection that were used in those projects. But you're my audience today. I think you're all going to be doing quite different kinds of work. Your practice and your productions are all going to be different from one another. And most Arts Council supported organizations are small teams or individuals. And you're often doing great work in local communities, but with limited time and resources. So we've put this webinar together with all that in mind. But I wasn't sure if we really had great examples of what good practice looks like in this space, in your sort of arena. So we would like to make this session quite collaborative, and we'd like you to think about any good examples you know of for evaluations and data collection in public spaces, the kinds of situations and public spaces that you work in and you might need to collect data from, and the kinds of things that you might need to find out. So that's quantitative data, so statistical things, qualitative data, so more free and conversational feedback. And in previous webinars in this series, people mentioned that they were interested in researching things like barriers to engagement that stop people from taking part in creative and cultural events. People were interested in audience development opportunities, so finding more people to come along and join in. And in evaluating direct outcomes of the work, the social and cultural value, and the impacts that works have. So often we might be working with harder to reach audiences in this space as well. And that's a key part of the way that we look at our audiences and the impacts that we have for those groups. So we'd really love to hear some stories from you about what you're doing. I'll give my initial ideas for the first half of the session, but feel free to reflect on your own experiences, and I'd really welcome it if you'd like to share them towards the end. You can come on screen if you want to, or just pop thoughts, ideas, and questions in the chat. So let's look at a couple of larger and more publicized examples to get the ball rolling. So these might not be perfect examples for the scale, budget, and type of work that we do, but hopefully it's useful to illustrate the kinds of things that are possible for evaluation if it was a perfect world and we had the resources that we needed. So first we'll take a look at an evaluation of a program called Let's Do London, which was in 2021 and 2022. So it was a vast program which was aimed at bringing more people back outside and doing things in London with a huge array of different events and activities. And that was commissioned by the London Tourism Recovery Board and delivered together by London and Partners and the Greater London Authority. Obviously, this had a fairly sizable budget, and it's a lot bigger than anything that most of us will be working on, but bear with me. So this is the main visualization in the report of the key findings, and we'll share a link to the full report on the website page because there's a few useful bits that we can pull out of it. So this isn't all of the data that they collected. Other numbers and statistics are peppered through the report, but these are the ones that they've identified as the most important given the stated aims and impacts of the programme, and the most likely to be of interest to readers of the report. You can see that half of the main findings is focused on the economic impact of all of the activity and about the partnerships and benefits to individual businesses involved and other people who worked on the project. So that economic focus makes sense for this project, since the goal was to bring in visitors to central London, and in doing so, increase the secondary spending to businesses in the area. And as well, there's some statistics about how many creative people found work as a result of the project. And in the aftermath of the pandemic, obviously there was a high unemployment in the cultural sector. In general, I don't think that most of the place-based work that happens in our communities has an economic focus as its main goal. I would imagine that most of you are funded to deliver work that provides mainly social and cultural benefits to your communities. But if we think about the work that most of you watching today will do, there might be a similar focus on things like increasing visitor numbers to public spaces and on providing people with opportunities for paid or voluntary work, to earn income or to increase skills and confidence, and to foster partnerships between several organizations or groups of freelancers working together, and the measurable and perceived benefits that that brings. Then there's data about how the project affected audiences. So not just in-person attendance, but things like how many people saw the work in published media, social media, and online views, as well as data about whether people were aware of the advertising and how they felt about the events and activities that they participated in. So overall, it's a nice and varied dashboard, and it tells the story of the scale and reach of the programme, as well as focusing on some of the impacts that it tried to deliver. If you keep reading past the headline numbers, there are some more interesting metrics buried in the rest of the report. So we've got information about secondary spend on food and drink. So 74% of those who intentionally visited, they then went on to spend an average of 46 quid in a cafe, pub, or restaurant. We've got statistics about prior awareness of the event, which is a useful question. So 44% of the people who attended were aware of it beforehand, and 99% of those who were aware of it intentionally visited for the event. And then 44% appears again in terms of the people agreeing that this kind of event encourages people to visit central London. So you can imagine putting together questions about those concepts. Awareness of an event, if it was the main motivation, or one of a few motivations for visiting, asking people about other things they're going to do whilst they're out, and perceptions about the event and the benefit that it brings to the local area. Some of these could be quite useful for a lot of the work that we do. Then two final bits. 72% hadn't attended an event in London Royal Parks before, so asking people if it's their first time at one of your events is useful to see if you're reaching a new audience. And finally, the effects of attending on the audience, which is probably the most interesting thing for us, increasing their confidence. So this is in the context of audiences going back to film and cinema after COVID. But quite a lot of you might be working on events in places where people don't do as much culture as in big cities. So a similar question could be around confidence attending specific art forms or event types, or creative and cultural events more generally, maybe for audiences who don't do a lot of it already. So what you might have noticed looking at that first dashboard is that some of the data sources were internal numbers that might have already been available to the organisers. Oh, nope. Sorry, I thought that slide was animated. These existing sources of data might include things like records of how many people and organisations were involved in the delivery, how many hours were spent by staff and volunteers, how many events were put on, or if there's a ticketed or commercial angle to an event, data might be available about how many tickets were sold and how much income was generated. There'll be data available from your digital channels, so website analytics, social media impressions, and any online advertising that you've used. Some of the data might have come from external organisations or partners. For example, if you've been covered in any local press, maybe you could ask them to see how many people viewed the story online. And in the London example before, some of the partner organisation is reporting financial data about the benefits that it brought them. They've also filled in surveys to give their sentiment about the benefits that it brought to them, like increased publicity and opportunities. They've worked with a local tourism office and combined that with their own survey results to determine how many additional visitors came to central London as a result of the programming. And then finally, the rest of the data appears to have been collected or measured by the project itself. So that includes survey responses of the audience to understand their awareness of the program, their feelings about it, and the impacts it delivers, and also counts of the number of visitors at each specific event. So a lot of potentially useful data may already be available to you for monitoring and evaluation purposes, either from within your own organization or from other people that you work with. But there'll be some important things about the audience that you would have to capture directly. So we'll cover audience data collection yourself in a moment. So I'll hit play on this. Hopefully it works while I talk. So I want to look at a second example. It's much shorter, mercifully, that we'll use to explore some of the different situations and the data collection methods that might be a bit closer to home for us. So many of you will already be familiar with 1418 now. So to commemorate the centenary of the First World War, a programme of public artworks and events was commissioned and organised, and 1418 now formed to steer it, working alongside a huge array of partner organisations and creative individuals. So one of the most high-profile works was the one you can see in the video, We're Here Because We're Here, by Jeremy Deller, which brought living ghosts of soldiers from 100 years ago to city centres and transport hubs all around the UK. The soldiers didn't speak, but when people approached them, they'd hand over a card with the name of a soldier and the date that the soldier died in the Battle of the Somme. So there's no sound on the video, but there's a moment where a lady isn't sure what's happening, gets handed one of those cards with a name and a date of death on it, and she's absolutely devastated. And it still makes me quite emotional thinking and seeing this work. And it's obviously just going to be very slow as well. Here we go. So let's have a really quick look at another one. I'll skip through. I have terrible internet, so this was probably a terrible choice. So this was Danny Boyle's work, Pages of the Sea, which had enormous sand portraits of people who were involved in the war effort, soldiers and civilians. And they were all people who either were killed or went missing. And it's a shame we can't see this. Hopefully it comes through in a moment. So giant sand portraits were placed on the beaches and they were slowly washed away by the tide. And it was really effective. So it's an act of commemoration that focused on specific soldiers and told the stories of forgotten people. And there was quite a diverse range of people included. I don't think that's going to load, is it? But you can see how something like that has an immediate relevance to people today, seeing specific people. Okay, I think we might have to skip that one. It's not going to happen for us, is it? Yeah, let's go. Okay, you can see one. That's fine. So why am I telling you all this? Well, one major thread that ran through the entire 4-year commemoration were the poppies installations. And they were first at the Tower of London, and then installations called the Weeping Window and Weeping Wave travelled to 19 different locations around the UK. So I had the privilege and the responsibility of managing audience data collection on the ground for the whole Poppies tour, as well as for several other 1418 Now commissions. So with my long-suffering colleague, Grace, we had to hire and train local people in each of those 19 locations to carry out surveys and other forms of data collection at every single one of the Poppies installations. So what did we need to find out? Well, many of the impacts were the same kind of ideas that we talked about in the London example. How many people saw each work? So we had to do visitor counting exercises. and reporting on how many additional visitors came to the locations, towns, and cities where they were based because of the poppies. So again, similar to the London example, we needed survey questions about whether it was one of the main motivating factors for their visit, or if they were just coming anyway. And there was the economic impact of the additional visitors, so we needed to ask how much they were planning to spend on their visit to the town. But that side of it, the tourism and secondary spend, is the less interesting and the more material part of the evaluation, and mainly for the benefit of the venues, local authorities, and funders. The 1418 Now Commissions and the installation's main goal was a public commemoration of the First World War. And for me, working on those projects during those years, even a few steps removed as I was, had an enormous impact on me and fundamentally changed my perceptions and awareness of the conflict and thinking about the tragedy of the young people who were lost in the war. So it still makes me really emotional seeing the poppies, and I think I would credit this whole 1418 Now program with that. So there were a range of impacts that they were aiming for in the people who saw the work. So there was an increased likelihood to attend outdoor arts in the future. And then moving on to the topic, an increased awareness of the First World War and of the history of the local area and the people from that area who fought and died in the war. And then finally, as a piece of public commemoration, reflecting whether this was the right way. Was it appropriate? Was it effective to commemorate the war? And we also had space for people to say what it meant for them. So we got all sorts of stories from people like me who suddenly felt that the war was more fresh and the history felt more real, to people who connected it to their own personal stories. So we even did a survey with someone who happened to be a descendant of Admiral Jellicoe, who was the commander of the Allied fleet in the Battle of Jutland. And that's one extreme example, but all of these individual conversations and reflections that we had recorded and brought the history and its connection to people and areas in the UK right into focus. And it told us whether the work was helping people to make those connections. So across the project, we did that with a mix of surveys, vox pop interviews, visitor counting, and other observations. And I'll come on to those methods shortly and how they work. So when you're deciding what to measure, the main thing is to have a framework and to plot out your main research objectives. You should think about the main goals and the strategic objectives that your organization and events have, and the types of data and insight that would be most useful for evaluating those. Keeping it limited to the minimum amount of data possible to ask survey respondents, rather than having multiple similar measures and metrics, will make it easier to collect the data and less of an ask for the people you interview. And while we might have a bold vision for what we want to do, we have to be realistic about the impact that our work will have on audiences. A work might be incredibly powerful and effective in a number of ways, but having too long a list of questions and possible outcomes might be too much for some audiences. Can we simplify it and get a couple of key metrics and maybe an open text response for anything deeper? And given that some people might be having really brief interactions, we need to factor in that to our data collection so we can be proportionate to the amount of time they're spending on the event. So we'll move on to the more practical side and look at the challenges of public data collection and the methods that you can use. So I mentioned at the start that we need to be mindful that audience data collection can be more challenging in public spaces. So let's lay out some of the barriers that might be in place, and we can start to think about how to approach them. The kinds of works that we're talking about may only grab people for a few seconds, or we might only engage them for a couple of minutes. Audiences at some public spaces might be less comfortable talking. Sometimes that will be for practical reasons, like events getting lots of families with young children who don't want to stop. Or we might be working in areas of higher social deprivation, or it might be in areas where people don't do as much art and culture. And so that might be a barrier to people wanting to help with data collection. or feeling confident and comfortable with expressing themselves. And some data collection involves taking a lot of personal information down, and that leads to a myriad of challenges. In some areas and communities, people can be quite suspicious of personal information being collected, for what it's being used for, who's collecting it. And also the length of the survey. If there are quite a few demographic questions, there'll be a sense that the questions aren't relevant. The person might have been expecting to be asked about the thing itself that they experienced, rather than just about themselves. And at festivals and gigs, or places where people might be drinking and having fun, there's a perception that the survey might spoil the experience for people taking part. So there's a need to explain why these questions are being asked and how it helps the organization. Some of those concepts I talked about in the last webinar, and that might be useful to help you explain that, thinking about identifying who's visiting your event and who's missing out. Some people might find it strange that they're asked some specific, sensitive, personal questions, and data collectors might need a nice and quick way of explaining why we have to ask those questions to everybody, and that there's lots of different ways that we look at audience demographics these days. And there's also trying to fit all of this activity around your busy schedule and your team's limited time and resources. So you might not have time to plan anything comprehensive, or, spend days and weeks developing your evaluation. And there might be limited time available for staff and volunteers to do the data collection, or even for briefings and support or management for people collecting surveys. For some public space works like events and festivals, there's a short burst of very intense activity over a few days, and there are always a million things that need doing. So in some cases, it might be worth looking for methods that are less intensive and less hands-on, so that you can more easily manage them. And finally, depending on all of those factors, staff and volunteers may also not feel confident about the approach that you take to data collection or the value of it. And so morale can be another challenge. So we need to have a view on all of our individual situations and just be realistic about the methods that we use and whether they're appropriate and proportionate for the kinds of interactions that we have with our visitors. So let's look through some of the different methods we could use to collect data in public spaces. And I'm going to go from, it sounds horrible, the least invasive to the most invasive, and you'll see why in a minute. So starting with the least invasive in an order that is very unscientific, I think it goes like this: visitor counting, observations, more creative methods, shorter surveys, vox pops, so more in-depth interviews, and then long surveys, getting more and more invasive as we go down the list. So we'll spend a minute on each one to explore how it works and where and when it might be appropriate. So in the earlier examples, we saw that one form of measurement can include the numbers of audiences or people who engage with the work. So we'll come on to some of the other methods shortly, but I wanted to take a minute to discuss visitor counting. Someone I spoke to recently gave an example of this done in a way that didn't quite work. And I don't mean any negativity or to make fun of the person who did it, because we're all often in the deep end doing things that we're not really sure how to do, and there's no time and nobody available to help. But in this case, an installation was placed in a shopping centre, and the number of people who engaged with it was given as about 700,000 or close to 1 million. That data made it back to the Arts Council in a sort of end of year sort of board report thing, and it was spotted, queried, and it turned out that was actually the number of people visiting the shopping centre itself. So unless 100% of people at the shopping centre saw the work, maybe it was a bit optimistic. So to accurately measure visitors or interactions, unfortunately, the only way to do it is some counting. So a lot of venue-based organizations like museums and galleries have automated systems to count people. And they can even look at people going in and out of specific rooms and parts of the building. But that's not likely to be the case in most public spaces. So it's probably a case of having someone standing there and counting the number of visitors or interactions. They might use a clicker like the one pictured on the slide, or there are apps on smartphones available as well. So you'd want to clearly define what counts as an interaction based on what your work is. Is it stopping and looking at it or talking to someone? Set this as a clear instruction so that there's no ambiguity, especially if multiple people are going to be counting. People might then fill in a counting sheet with numbers written down at regular intervals, and I would suggest every 10 or 15 minutes. If your event is in place for a longer period of time, or even if not, you don't have to have someone counting all the time. You can do shorter shifts to collect data on visitor counts at different times of day and on different days. And we do some maths at the end to figure out daily, weekly, and overall totals. So you could do some morning, afternoon, or evening counting sessions spread in a pattern across a few different days. But make sure you also capture enough data during weekends as well. You ideally want to capture a few timed shifts during the week and the same on weekends. You'll want to also do some counting during different weather conditions, as particularly bad or good weather will likely lead to fewer or more people attending outdoor activities. During bad weather, indoor spaces can get busier than usual. You might also want to check weather data or have someone keep a log of the weather conditions on site during each morning and afternoon, and you can then use that to do your calculations later. So to work it all out, you need to have enough counting data to stitch together visitor counts, working out rough averages that might be expected each day based on the weather, the day, and the time of day. If you've got something else to compare it to, that you might be able to use that as a useful yardstick as well. Say you're in a shopping center, you might have the daily visitor counts for the whole center, and you could use that to weight your numbers up or down accordingly. It's not an exact science, but the more counting that you do, the more accurate you can be with your averages. And just be clear in your findings how you arrived at the numbers, and make clear that they're based on averaged measurements, and maybe give an idea of how much measurement that you did. So moving on, and we'll be quicker on the others, I promise. Observations. Oh, my headset's just disconnected. Observations are an interesting form of data collection, which doesn't have to involve gathering any surveys at all. It's an exercise that works best when evaluating how people interact with a space or an installation. An observer is placed somewhere, or camera footage is reviewed, and they select people engaging with the work at random to be observed, and then details are recorded about what that person did. You might record in order the different parts that they interacted with, and whether they speak to someone, and how long they spend interacting or engaging. One really key part to give you some interesting data is to use a scale to figure out how deeply engaged they were with the work. Since you're not surveying them and asking them, this scale needs to be based on things that are observable. So I've come up with an example scale here. Maybe it goes like level 1. They very briefly engage with the work, but they don't stop. At level 2, they spend more time engaging, might look at some elements or displays, but don't really read or talk to anyone. Level 3, they work through the content methodically to see and read everything, and that's usually the level I'm at. Level 4, more of a self-led journey. They pick out and engage deeply with specific items and displays of interest. They spend time reading information about them, or talking to staff and volunteers, or someone they're with about the works that they've picked. So you might also record some very basic observable details about the respondent. For example, are they visiting alone, with another adult, or with children? In some cases, the person observed can then be approached to complete a survey, and the observations recorded would be matched up to them. However, there's no guarantee that someone you observe would also agree to be surveyed. You can capture all of this and put it into a paper form, and then put it into a spreadsheet, and that will turn it into data that you can then work with and use in a quantifiable, statistical way. If you want to do that, maybe try to get at least 30 observations or more if possible. So we always talk about creative methods as an alternative to surveying to boost engagement. And that can mean a lot of different things. It's not particularly my strong suit, but there are loads of examples out there online. And if you want to find more about that, you can just Google creative evaluation methods. So as an approach, it's an alternative to survey methods. And the idea is to boost people's engagement. So it's maybe having more engaging, enjoyable, or expressive methods. Maybe that's as simple as giving people a piece of paper to write on and put on a wall to say how they feel, or putting tokens in a box to vote on a key impact. Or maybe it's asking people to express how they feel in a way that references the art form in some way. So maybe you ask people to draw a picture or write a song about how they felt after seeing the work. And if they did that, what would the picture show? What would the lyrics be about? Or maybe you ask people to design the perfect show or event and explain why they've done it that way. And you can figure out what they really want and if there are things that could be improved about your own work. It can be difficult to catch people after a performance, as everyone tends to leave at the same time. So one method that's becoming more popular is to invite a small number of people to join a post-show group discussion about what they saw. So that's maybe a little different in intent than a traditional focus group, in that it's intended to be an interesting discussion with more emphasis on the benefits to the participants. The focus of the conversation might be about the work and people's reactions to it, but a moderator can keep it relevant to the topic and to try to tease out potential learnings and improvements for the organization. Now, this is a bit of a tangent for this webinar, and it's not necessarily suitable for a lot of public spaces work, but since I've got a soapbox today, co-creation can be really interesting and useful in very specific circumstances. So especially if you're doing group workshops or something like that, one trick that's often used and is really effective with young participants is to ask them to help you come up with how the work that they just participated in should be reflected on. What should be measured and asked? And it needs to be useful, so you should give them some of the basic impacts that you were hoping to make, but then give participants themselves the chance of deciding what should be looked at, how we should ask about it. Then maybe the group kind of votes or answers the question. It'll structure the responses in a way that makes more sense to the participants and perhaps captures things that you'd not anticipated. So a Vox Pop is a much shorter interview. It's 5 or 10 minutes. It's qualitative in nature, so it's more freeform and conversational than a survey. The idea is to generate quick and useful insights or quotations that can help take the temperature of an audience and give you quotes that will illustrate your research findings. So although a couple of straightforward yes or no questions might be useful to establish facts about the respondent, typically you'll want to ask more open questions and probe for useful insights. Vox Pops are usually gathered by intercepting people, visitors you've approached at random, and they're typically not incentivized. Now, they are often audio recorded, so you do need to do some housekeeping around that, as audio recordings count as a form of personally identifiable data. So at a minimum, you need to clearly explain to people what the audio recording will be used for, who will have access to it, and that includes any transcription services, and how long until the file is deleted. And you should make your privacy notice available to them, covering all of that. And in most cases I've worked on, we actually asked people to sign on paper and give written consent that they were aware of all of those privacy details. So that might sound like a lot. We were talking about least invasive methods, weren't we? And it can be off-putting to some, but once you say that you have to do it because of privacy laws to get through the paperwork, but that it's really useful to hear from people, most audiences are happy to do it. And I think that carrying out Vox Pops with a dictaphone or a voice recorder is really interesting, more so than surveys. And I've had some wonderful, interesting, funny conversations with people from a variety of places and events. I even spent a couple of days doing them in Texas at the Alamo with some very bemused Americans who were wondering why a weird British guy was asking them how they felt about history. Alternatively, you could take a vox pop type approach, but not audio record it. Maybe you just type it into a form as qualitative feedback. And a useful tip if you are typing in people's open responses is to just read back what they've said as you type it in, because it basically stops them from talking whilst you're typing it in until you're ready for them to say something else. So using a longer survey, and a longer survey might feel less appropriate if there are a lot of challenges that we've mentioned before. So shorter engagement time, lots of families, less engaged audiences. But if you're an MPO, you might have to collect surveys for Elluminate, for example. And if you do have to do that, you might find my previous webinar useful on how to collect high quality surveys. So to reiterate some of the stuff I said in that, the best tools you have are making it easy for people to participate. So email the survey if you have contact information from a ticket booking or something like that. Or give a QR code or a link that they can take away. And it's really important to make a human appeal, how the survey is needed to keep funding this kind of work and how it helps support the local community and grow your organization. If staff and volunteers are having interactions with people, welcoming them to the site, giving information, is there a way that you can slip the survey into that process and have those staff and volunteers point people to a link? Incentivization is a bit of a last resort. I often feel it comes with its own issues because it can make the interaction about the incentive and less about the work and your survey and questions. Traditionally, you could just hand over cash, but giving out £5 notes is going to get expensive these days. And there's risks in terms of carrying cash and things like that. You could do a prize draw, but you have to collect email addresses and make sure you're compliant for GDPR purposes. Have the same privacy notice that I talked about before. You could do something like give away food or snacks if it's okay in the area that you're working. In the example I gave before of working in Texas, it was very hot and we ended up giving out chilled bottles of water to people to get them to take part in a survey. Another method that I quite like is to donate money to charity for every complete survey. So maybe for everyone who fills in your survey, 50p goes to a sort of local charity or something like that. So we need to be realistic about the methods that we use and whether they're appropriate and proportionate for the kinds of interactions that we're having with visitors. So I've arranged them here in a sort of scale of how invasive and therefore how difficult they might be to carry out. So think about that in relation to which challenges you might run into and decide the level that might be most appropriate. So for example, keeping a survey as short as possible to keep respondents happy and make it easier to get people to stop. Relying on more conversational methods like a vox pop interview or a creative method. Maybe some of the quick and easy creative methods like a post-it note on a wall or putting a token in a box might be a convenient or attractive way for people to participate. Or maybe you're so unlikely to be able to get people to stop that you would be best just sticking to observations and visitor counts. So that's all of my material for today and the ways of thinking that I would apply to this kind of work. So we covered situations and works to evaluate in public spaces, the concepts and metrics that we could measure, identifying the most relevant and useful metrics, some of the challenges of working in public spaces, data collection methods that we could use, and calculating a proportionate and appropriate method. So we'll move on to the open discussion shortly. As a reminder, we do offer free, unlimited one-on-one support on this topic and many others. So if you would like to get in touch with one of our tech champions or just browse our resources, please do go to the Digital Culture Network website or drop us an email if you're not sure where to get started and we'll get you on the right path. So hopefully you've been thinking about interesting stories and evaluations you might be aware of and could share, or about your own work and the challenges and techniques that you currently use. So do feel free to put your hand up using the raise hand button or pop things in the chat. I just need to swap over my headphones. I can't hear anything. So bear with me for a few seconds.
While Jack changes his headphones, please feel free to add questions in the chat. And as he said, please feel free to raise your hand and unmute to share your question. I'm going to go through the chat. There's a comment that I just wanted to come back to from Evoke Kirklees about some evaluation questions that they are preparing for a town center festival in February. If Evoke Kirklees would like to come on and speak about what they're working on, they're welcome to do so. But they don't want to ask a lot of people's questions and they don't have technology. So it has to be paper-based. Do you have any ideas about how they could do this without having to input hundreds of questionnaires by hand?
Yeah, that's tough, isn't it? I think if you are collecting them on paper, there will have to be some form of data entry. So I guess it's keeping it as short and sweet as possible. Maybe that's just a really focusing in those questions on what's really going to be useful to you in your practice. Thinking about the data that you get and whether that's really useful to you. It's something that we could help with one-to-one support. I think that really the core questions are kind of mainly about motivation. Like, why did people come to the event? What did they want to get out of it? And that gives you so much information that you can use. Then perhaps it's just stuff like the demographics, a rating, and marketing channels that they saw. How were they aware of the event? So keep it focused, I think.
Thank you. Julia has given some examples of the different engagement methods that they use and how they kind of categorize them, as Jack indicated, with the primary and secondary kind of engagement levels, and then also providing different forms of feedback in terms of a whiteboard audiences can engage with, Vox Pop using mobile phones, and just a variety of different examples for different settings. We also have a question about whether asking the questions at the booking stage, which I guess is good if you are available, asking people to book for public events.
Yeah, that's a really useful one. I think you don't want to put too much at that stage because you don't want to put people off booking the ticket. But definitely the stuff, around marketing channels, how they were aware of it, and maybe a motivation question there. And perhaps postcode is a really useful one at that stage because it feels quite natural when you're booking a ticket. And then you've got those people's contact information. So then maybe you can send a survey and with a bit more information. Not everyone will fill that in, but you've got the most important questions out of the way on the booking form.
Also, there's a suggestion here for, I guess it's a good way if you don't have technology on site, but including a QR code that people could scan and engage with a brief survey on their phones is a good suggestion, especially if the information is sensitive. I sometimes find that people don't like sharing demographic information in public, so that can also be a good way around that.
It's great for families as well. Like if they can't stop for the survey, they can take a QR code away.
There was a suggestion here for a great outdoor art visitor count tool. Are you familiar with that, Jack, or do you know of any that might be similar to the one that's suggested here by Jacob?
Oh, is this the Revolution Arts example?
Yes.
Let's have a look. Maybe I'm looking at the wrong comment. Let's just did no, yeah, it's the same one. Oh, hang on. Sorry, my brain is fried today. Sorry. A great outdoor art visit account tool. One of our contracts use. Oh, and then has he posted it a bit further down? No, I think Jacob tried to find a tool.
I think he had one and he said he would maybe send it to people who are interested.
Yeah, I was
I
thinking.
can follow up with him about that.
I thought that might be useful because although I explained a lot of the principles of visit accounting, I think maybe actually applying it would still be you'd want a really good spreadsheet to enter in the data. You'd want to have good paperwork to log that. So anything that's a bit more specific on that could be really useful for people to share afterwards.
Yeah, for sure. We have a question here from Claire on smoothing the ethics process. They do a lot of work with academic researchers for eval. Are there any tips on smoothing that process over?
No, it's a nightmare. Yeah, I guess it's not an arena I'm particularly familiar with. I've mostly experienced it being a fieldwork supplier and waiting months for stuff to get signed off. I guess so. I probably am not the right person to speak to it, but I suppose anything you can do to anticipate possible hurdles in the ethics process and maybe speak to colleagues and people who've gone through that process. Maybe you could short circuit some of the possible issues that would come up.
We have a question from Louise at Peterborough Presents. With limited capacity, they find it hard to balance the requirements of Illuminate and culture counts, as well as their own research around well-being, marketing, etc. Events are often pop-up rather than bookable. Do you have any suggestions for managing those requirements?
Yeah, I guess I would say Illuminate is sort of required. So I guess that becomes the focus for a lot of organizations. You can collect Illuminate survey data through other platforms. So you can actually collect your Illuminate surveys through culture counts. They have templates with the Illuminate questions. So you could ask the mandatory questions there and also get some of those evaluation statements that come on culture counts as well, and do both. I think if I was trying to work in this space, I would just want one survey that was the ultra survey that did everything. That might not be possible if you've got lots of evaluation questions that you need to ask. Perhaps you do need those two survey links, but yeah, I would maybe be asking the Illuminate mandatory questions in another place on my own survey platform and asking all the questions that I wanted to ask as well. I've not really fully answered the other part of the question, which is around pop-up events. So you're not collecting contact information. So I guess it's about that kind of in-person approach then. It's about staff and volunteers signposting people to the QR code and the links and sort of really selling the survey or other methods.
I had a question about when you were talking about essentially counting or sampling in public spaces. Does the approach to counting change the longer an exhibition or a work is out in public? Because sometimes the attendance or the attention might be more at the beginning than later on. Do you have any experience with that?
Yeah, so when I was talking about getting a range of different days, I guess the way to address that would be to count days towards the end of the run as well. You do sort of see it as a sort of reverse bell curve sometimes. Like we saw that with exhibitions a lot, that there would be a rush of visitors on the last few days. You realize that it's going to be taken down and you don't want to miss it, so you get a few extra people right at the end. So I guess it's just sampling and doing the visitor counts throughout the process and getting a really good representative spread of days throughout.
I had one more question on observations. Sometimes observing people in a public space can be difficult because there can be a lot going on. Do you have suggestions for making guides or protocols to help filter what you're observing?
Yeah, I guess the more you can give people a sort of examples of what you're looking for would be useful. When we were thinking about those engagement states, the 4 levels, I guess it would be useful to maybe have an in-person demonstration of what that might look like. Maybe you kind of all as a group kind of watch people for a little bit and agree which ones are doing which states, or you could even sort of produce short videos that sort of demonstrate that. But yeah, if it's really busy, it can be very difficult to keep track of people. We were doing something for the V&A when they opened their new European galleries that are sort of in the basement. And we had to follow people through multiple rooms, which was I probably wouldn't have done it that way, thinking back on it, because it was kind of, it looked quite suspicious. Sort of, for one thing, you're kind of literally staring at people and following them through rooms, but just losing track of people and kind of missing key moments. So maybe break it up into smaller chunks and just everyone have really good examples and really good onboarding for people doing the observations.
Great, thank you. Do we have any other questions for Jack?
Or if anyone wants to come on and sort of talk about the work that they're doing at the moment.
Absolutely. Louise has put in the chat that the company they use to track visitor movement and engagement at an outdoor festival in Peterborough was Artisani Research, critical analysis of the outdoor arts.
I'll check that out. There's actually quite a lot of stuff with technology at the moment, and I guess budgets are very variable. But there is, let's see if I can find this example. A friend of mine works in this space doing stuff with AI solutions. So because there are sort of mobile phone data can be used to track how many people are in a space. So he was doing something. Where is this article? Perhaps we can share it afterwards. But it was kind of anticipating who was there to visit specific events and cultural attractions on Malta, and who was just kind of commuters and people moving through the space normally. So that kind of gave evaluation data about sort of visitor numbers and sort of peaks and troughs of that. But it also gave a live dashboard so that they knew whether they needed more staff in the shop or more staff in front of house. So there's some kind of interesting tools that are being worked on right now with technology and AI and all these sorts of things. Perhaps we'll see more of that in the next few years.
We have one more question in the chat from Janie. Does anyone have any examples of evaluating impact of public realm artworks like art murals in an ongoing way?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because you can imagine there's a lot of it often happens in a sort of coordinated way now, doesn't it? So at the Arts Council, a lot of us are based in the Northern Quarter in Manchester, and there's kind of a system of murals all over that are sort of almost encouraged by the sort of local businesses and the sort of area council. And I guess there's sort of potential benefits of that. It brings tourism. It sort of makes people feel better seeing kind of great artwork on the sides of buildings. It's not something I have an example of, unfortunately, but I guess, yeah, you'd need the kind of collection of people who were responsible for murals, and then maybe they would have an interest in it.
Yeah, I guess it's also similar to what you suggested earlier with being able to sample from different periods of time over the duration of the display, and taking an average over a period of a few months. So unless we have any questions, we will wrap up there. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Jack, for your amazing presentation today. That was really helpful. Hi, Claire.
I was just going to say to people, sorry, I don't mean to butt in, but I've had a lot of really good experience working with the local authorities because I collect a lot of data anyway. So if you're not, I don't want to teach people to suck eggs, but if you're not already engaged with insight teams within your local authority, I'd definitely have a conversation with them because they're really helpful and they have got a lot of data that you can build on. And then certainly my experience of working in the Midlands, we've done quite a lot of work through that route and then building on that research around cultural impact. So
that's a great suggestion. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, there are so many great people in local authorities doing like amazing work with organizations on shoestring budgets. So there's a lot there. I think that I bet there's a load of great case studies that you could find that way.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Take care. Thanks for coming, everybody.